Shortly after David is anointed by the prophet Samuel, we find ourselves in the situation where Israel and the Philistines are at war once again. You've probably heard this story before. It's the story of David defeating Goliath. But let's dive into the scripture together and let's see some details that God gives to you and to me as believers that we can utilize to better understand how we're not David. Jesus is David. He is the Christ who has defeated our enemy, the Goliath, so to speak, the devil at the cross. Let's dive into the story. Let's look at what takes place and let's learn for ourselves how we can grow together in our walk with God. Chapter 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Succoth in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Damim between Soka and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. It's interesting when you read Psalms 23 and you hear this psalm that's so famous that David would write. It's interesting that this battle takes place in the valley of Elah. David would write in the Psalms, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The Lord will prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Was Goliath not prepared before the Philistines, the enemies of David? And David's cup would runneth over. It's very likely that in Psalms 23, David is writing about this critical and key moment in his life. It says that as this took place, the Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. Your Bible margin will say that he's somewhere between 9 feet and 10 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. That's estimated to be around 125 pounds. And on his legs were bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, or about 15 pounds. Basically, he was a giant. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." Goliath is a picture of the enemy, the accuser of the brethren, who accuses God's people, the Israelites, day and nights. But we know the accuser of the brethren has been struck down. He says, "Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your servants. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Here's the reality. You and I were just like the rest of the Israelites. Sometimes we read this story and we hear it as kids and we're like, "Oh, I want to be David." You're not David. I'm not David. The Lord, Jesus, is David, who went before us and did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves, who defeated the enemy of Israel. Israel meaning God's people. And it says that they're terrified, that they're unable to move, that they won't go into battle, that they stay and they hold their position as Goliath mocks them and taunts them. Verse 12, now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them." There was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. Basically, David's dad sent him to bring food to his sons, at the same time to bring gifts to their commanding officers so that they would find favor and not be put at the front of the battle. David's dad was strategic. Verse 20, early in the morning, David left the flock in care of the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked, his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Here's where it gets interesting. Verse 25. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? How he comes out to defy Israel? How he keeps, in essence, coming out to defy God's people, to defy the will of the Lord. Now they begin to speak in the natural. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He also give him his daughter in marriage. And here's the real one. He will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. Think about that. You get a lot of money. You get to marry the king's daughter, which means you get to be a part of the royal family. And you never have to pay taxes for your whole family. You would think that there would be a line to fight this Goliath dude, but no one dared because he was 9'6" and he was terrifying. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Interesting choice of words David uses. He calls him a disgrace. And then he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Who is this man that is not in covenant with God that he should defy the armies of the living God? They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how prideful you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. His brother was frustrated and angry at him. It's very possible his brother was jealous that he had been anointed to become the next king. It's very possible that his brother, who was the oldest, felt that he had been passed over and had aught in his heart against David. We don't know, but it's very likely. And in this moment, he's accusing his brother of being prideful, of just wanting to come watch people fight and wanting to come watch people die. David replies back in verse 29, what did I do? Can I not even speak? Do I not have the right to speak out loud? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. And the man answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart and encounter this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Verse 33. Saul replied, you're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. Verse 34. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it, and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. I struck it, and I killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. Basically, he says, God has prepared me. In obscurity, in the wilderness, when no one was looking, God has prepared me. He has used me to defeat the lion and the bear that attacked the sheep. He will use me to defeat this uncircumcised Philistine. He says he will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. David always turns it back to the Lord. He always turns it back to the Philistines' defiance of God is what will be his demise. The devil's defiance of the Lord will be his and has been his demise. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. So Saul said to David, go, may the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own armor. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around, but he was not used to them. Saul tried to dress him up to look like him. The reality was Saul was not willing to go out to battle. Saul was afraid to fight the enemies of Israel. Saul should have gone out and should have sought God and should have been willing to fight the ones who defied the armies of Israel, but he was not. And so what he tried to do was he tried to dress up one who was willing to look like him. And David said, I can't go. I'm not used to this armor. This isn't you. This is your armor, Saul. This isn't me. We don't need to try to be like everyone else or imitate other people. God has made you to be you and me to be me. I don't need to try to be like you. You don't need to try to be like me. You need to be who God has called you to be. He took him off, and he took a staff, and he took 5 smooth stones from the stream. He put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and he went out with a sling in his hand to fight the Philistine. So your boy goes out with a rock and a slingshot. He chooses not to wear the armor. Meanwhile, the Philistine with a shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods, little g, his false gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. So David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword and spear and javelin. You come against me in the natural. But I'm coming against you in the name of the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. Goliath, this is not a natural battle. This is a spiritual battle. And the Lord is going to go before me. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Verse 48. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. David did not wait for his enemy to approach him. It says that he began to run at him. It's interesting. We'll learn that he'll use a slingshot and a rock. And obviously, his hand was guided by the Lord. And obviously, the Lord went before him, and that's why he was able to kill him. But even scientifically, it's interesting how Goliath begins to move at him. He begins to move at Goliath. You have two objects running at each other, and as he's slinging the slingshot, the object is propelled forward. So you have all this nerdy math taking place, and I can only imagine the velocity at which this rock hit Goliath. It said that it went into his skull. It sunk into his skull. We're about to read it in a moment. It says that as this took place, he reached into his bag and he took out a stone. He slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. The impact was so strong that the rock went through his skin. I don't mean to be graphic, but I'm about to. And it went through his skull. It sunk into his head and he died from the impact, from that blunt force trauma. So he's dead. It says in verse 50, that David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and he killed him. Now, after he's dead, David runs and he stands over him. He takes the sword of Goliath, he draws it, and he kills him and cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath, to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sharon road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered the camp. This is a picture of how David is a picture of Christ. This is a picture of how in 1 Corinthians 15 it says, praise be to God who always gives us the victory in Jesus Christ. It wasn't just David's victory. It was a victory that was shared with all of Israel, with God's people. David took the Philistine's head, he brought it to Jerusalem, and he put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, whose son is that young man? Abner replied, surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know. The king said, find out whose son this young man is. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. All right, now I'm not going to lie to you, this is pretty intense. Imagine you just had like the greatest day of your life. You just killed Goliath. Your adrenaline's running crazy. They go in battle. They do all the stuff. And your man David is still holding the head of Goliath. So like everywhere he goes, he's holding the head of Goliath with one hand and a sword in the other. I mean, imagine how intimidating that is for the Philistine armies and everyone around. Like, this guy, you're about to see the making of a war king. And we'll read throughout the remaining chapters of how God would use David in a mighty way and that he would go out into battle and that the Lord would go before him. And he gets before Saul and Saul asks him, whose son are you? And he says, I'm the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem. David from there, we'll learn later, would serve Saul before he was betrayed by Saul later on and pursued. But through all that, we see that David continues to have a right heart and a right attitude. And because he puts God first, and because he keeps his hands clean and his heart pure, God goes before him all the days of his life. This story for you and for me is a picture of how Jesus fights our battle. Jesus crushed the head of the serpent at the cross. It's Jesus who goes before us and fights our battles. Be blessed today.